Hello. Today I'd like to talk about personality typology. Typology is the study of psychic temperament, psychological type. The theory, or the idea behind personality typology, is that different people have different temperaments, whether from nature or nurture, whether inborn or learned. There is a distinct difference in the temperament of different people. There are a number of problems with personality typology, which has led it to be largely discredited. For instance, one of the longest running sort of themes of personality typology is based on what's called the four humors, or the four temperaments. And this is an idea which is traced back to even beyond medieval times, even to ancient Greece and prehistory, where it's kind of the idea that, you can see it in many different cultures, that there's a fire type person or a water person, an earth person, a wind person. And so this largely discredited theory of personality typology still has remnants in things like Jungian personality type theory, as well as Myers-Briggs, socionics, even evolutionary psychology and cognitive psychology and things like that have, people like Theodore Millon have developed their own personality typologies, which, more contemporary type theory doesn't really talk about the elements or the humors, but this still remains somewhat of the theoretical underpinning or the distinction. There's something like a quaternary distinction between the four personality types, which are then subdivided to 8 or 16. I mean, if we want to simplify even more, we could say there's two personality types, the active and the passive. But again, these kinds of ideas, although they've been around for millennia, have really fallen into disrepute. So I'd like to talk about personality typology and kind of talk about the theory that I endorse, which is essentially based on the work of Carl Jung, while also addressing some of the problems of typology, such as whether or not it can be scientific. I would say no. I would say typology cannot be a science, except perhaps in the original definition of science, but certainly not in the modern definition of science as something falsifiable. Indeed, personality typology is not falsifiable, which has led the more scientific-minded, of us to completely reject it. But the interesting thing is, because of this lack of falsifiability, it means that there's really no neutral ground with which we can tell the truth about various personality types. And so the whole idea of falsifiability is that we have to be able to somehow find something that wouldn't be evidence in favor of a certain belief. And with typology, we really can't do that. What's so difficult is that there's no type outside of type. So even the type that doesn't believe in typology is a type. Or, it's almost like if I discover typology and I think, well, I want to be a balance of all the different types. I don't want to be any one type. I want to try to balance myself. Well, that is a type, the type that tries to be a balance of the different types. Or if I say, who cares about this? It may be true, but it's not relevant to me. Well, that's also a type, the type that's indifferent to typology. So it really gets into difficulty here because it's unfalsifiable in the same way that psychoanalytic symptoms are unfalsifiable. If I experience loss and grieve, then my grief is a symptom. But if I experience loss and don't grieve, my lack of grieving is also a symptom. So as with psychoanalysis, there's an inability to falsify because there's never a case you can conceive of which is not explained away by the theory. And this is why, again, the more scientific-minded of us will reject typology as being unscientific. I agree, it is unscientific. It's theoretical. And theory and science are different. As Heidegger put it, science doesn't think. And rather than the unthinking of science being a limitation or lack of science, well, certainly it's a limitation, but this very limitation, it's actually a boon. It's the very locomotion of science, is its inability to think. And here I'm speaking of science, again, not in the classic term like somebody might talk of astrology or alchemy as a science, but in the more modern definition of science kind of developed by Karl Popper and other philosophers of science, which is something falsifiable, something which has empirical evidence, which can demonstrate its veracity, and so on. When I speak of science, I'm referring to the science which is concerned with factual validity in reality. The kind of a scientific mindset which would ask, well, did this really happen, or did it just happen in your imagination? Did it really happen, or was it just a dream? Well, imagination and dreams have their own reality as well. But again, this has kind of been delegated to the realm of mysticism, which used to be a science. What's funny is if you read, classic alchemical texts, occult texts, esoteric, and so on, what you find is that they always refer to their work as science. But again, this is the more classic. So in the contemporary understanding of science, which relies on falsifiability, I would say typology is very unscientific. If we're going to talk about the classic definition of science, then typology is a science. It's a science in the classic way, not in the falsifiable way, but it's a science in the same way that Vedic medicine is a science, in the same way that Chinese medicine is a science. There are certain sciences which are ancient, mystical, and so on, which have basically they've fallen into disrepute. They've been refuted, they've been discarded, rejected, and so on. So now, if you look up the theory of temperament on Wikipedia, for instance, you'll find on the very first line, the theory of temperament has now been disproven, or has now been rejected. But historically, this is what some people thought, mistakenly. So again, it's difficult because as much as the contemporary personality type theories attempt to distance themselves or be separate from this theory of temperament, again, the idea that there's fire people or water people and so on, as much as the contemporary type theory has attempted to distance itself from this, there is this sort of bond or underlying fundamental connection, especially in the way that it's completely unfalsifiable, that there's no neutral type. There's no type. The difficulty is that even the descriptions of types are biased based on the type describing. So a thinking type describes a feeling type completely different than how feeling types would describe themselves. And of course, we get into so many things like cognitive biases and ego narcissism and so on, which makes it especially difficult because there are so many typology tests which rely on self-assessment. And the problem, of course, with self-assessment is that we may end up describing our idealized image of ourselves, who we'd like to be, or on the contrary, if we have low self-esteem, maybe some vilified, demonized image of ourselves. But either way, it's not accurate. Either we describe ourselves as too good or too bad, as this or as that, A feeling type may describe herself or himself as a thinking type because she or he perhaps idolizes thinking types, or the opposite, So it's really problematic. I guess I'd like to talk about typology, and I'll endorse a certain understanding of type theory, essentially the Jungian type theory, as well as Myers-Briggs. I endorse that. But what I do not endorse is the self-assessment or the kind of cavalier, oh yeah, I'm a thinking type, so that means I'm smart, or I'm a sensing type, so that means that I'm good at physical things. And there's a lot of simplifications that really gloss over the particularities of the different types. And the other thing is that each of us really has access to all of these functions. All typology is a preference for some function over another. Carl Jung said there are 4 ego functions: sensing, intuiting, thinking, and feeling. Well, if I say I'm a thinking type, which in fact I am, it doesn't mean that I don't have feelings. It doesn't mean that I don't feel things. If I'm an intuitive, which again I am, it doesn't mean that I don't use sense functioning, that I'm not present in the sense world. It simply means that I prefer intuition over sensing. I prefer thinking over feeling. And there's a certain speed involved. I can think quickly. I can intuit quickly. But I don't sense quickly. Sense memory, experiential memory, that takes me a long time. I have to conjure it up. If you ask me what I had for breakfast yesterday, I might take a few minutes even to remember, or at least a few seconds. But if you ask me what date a certain book was released or when a theory was first developed, I can tell you that quite quickly. The same for feelings. I'm quite slow with feelings. If you ask me how I feel about something, it may take me some time to come up with an answer. So first, I'd like to get into the problems of typology. Then I'll move on to what I consider to be my understanding, I guess, of type theory, my theoretical opinions about type. So first, the problems that I see, two of the main problems are normativity and falsifiability. And these are two different problems. The problem of normativity is almost the problem that a postmodernist, a literary critic, a post-colonialist, someone who studies gender performativity, things like that, they might, someone in the humanities might complain about normativity. The normativity, the labeling, the categorizing, the fact that we would value designation over nomination, these types of complaints. These would be, the problem that the humanities departments would find with typology is very different than the problems that the hard sciences would find with it. It seems that almost both sides have problems with typology, but they're very different problems. The problem that the humanities departments would have with typology is that by being normative, it's basically, we need look no further than Jacques Derrida's deconstruction of normativity as always hiding some hegemonic privilege. Even the idea that the discourse, the language that we use, someone like Foucault did a lot to develop this line of thought. He wonderfully showed how medicalization and so on basically is a way of designating people and marginalizing, silencing them. If we medicalize, if we designate, this person's this type and that type is not suitable for what we need for society, so we should encourage them to be this type and not that, or, there's this whole idea from the anti-normativity perspective, which, I have to say I am very partial to. I, too, am against normativity, that says, well, typology is just completely normative. It says that typology is this normative description that fails to grasp. Typology pretends to be this universal ahistorical theory about these universal, even almost Platonic forms, male, female, active, passive, thinking, feeling, So the complaint here would be, well, if we classify people as feeling types, aren't we merely designating them, labeling them as feeling types? And isn't there a certain kind of denigration of the feeling type then? Isn't it almost slanderous to say, oh, you're just a feeling type, you wouldn't understand this, or something like that? So that's the first complaint, really, is about normativity. But to that, I would answer that typology actually addresses this, good type theory. Because good type theory, such as, for instance, the work of Marie-Louise von Franz or James Hillman, these are, Jungian theorists who've come up with, these ideas about type theory where they, for example, James Hillman says, well, yes, it is true that feeling types are demonized by society, as are introverts. Society is essentially values extroverts so much. So indeed, you can use typology as a critique of normativity. You can use typology as a way of saying, look, these people have been marginalized, oppressed. Certain types of people have been marginalized and oppressed. So the anti-normativity brigade that also lumps in typology with normativity attacks typology as a form of normativity. But what I'm saying is that you can actually use typology itself to attack normativity. So to clarify, if I were to say, oh, I don't believe in typology, it's so normative, it tries to fit people into boxes, it claims to be some sort of ahistorical, universal thing, if I were doing that, I claim I would be failing to grasp that I can actually use typology to make that very same critique of oppression, of marginalization, and so on. So it's almost like if I say typology is a tool of oppression, typology is used as a way to marginalize people, to classify them, to designate them, to label people, then I guess what I would be failing to grasp is that understanding of typology can actually combat the very labeling that I decry. So, what I mean here is that James Hillman, for instance, has shown how society essentially favors extroverts. And I don't even mean American society, Western society, I mean almost universally. I'm not saying it's ahistorical. Maybe historically there have been certain particular societies which have been run by introverts, but I doubt it, because introverts make up the minority of the population. So introverts are always the underdog. Introverts are always the minority of any population. We've never, as far as I know, anthropologists, sociologists have never discovered a population that is predominantly introverts. In fact, only about 1 in 5, 20% of people are introverts. So, as James Hillman points out, introverts are always ostracized, marginalized. Their voices are silenced. Same too with feeling types. Feeling types are demonized as not being very smart. So we can use the understanding of typology by understanding that there is a difference between feeling and thinking to show how, yes, thinking types do tend to dominate and marginalize feeling types. So basically, the critique of typology as a tool of oppression or as some normative kind of hegemonic, privileged way, a discourse of the privileged and so on, basically that critique falls flat because typology itself can level the same critique using the vocabulary of typology. And when I say typology, I mean generally here, any theory, whether it's Jungian or socionics or what have you, because, again, it's almost, I'll put it this way, the deconstructionists and various other postmodern schools are about affirming alterity, which is affirming difference, affirming radical difference even. And how can we affirm difference without typology? Because without typology, everyone's the same. Or you might say, well, everyone's so different, since no two people are alike, we're all unique snowflakes, we're all special, and so on, then how can you classify people? But to that I would say, if we're all individual, that means we're all the same. To really affirm alterity means to make distinctions between types of people. So radical alterity means that there is a radical split between thinking and feeling, between sensing and intuiting, between introversion and extroversion, or even between perceiving and judging, as the distinction from Myers-Briggs goes. So in a way, I guess my claim here is that we need something like typology to be able to affirm radical alterity. Because without personality types, we don't have a way of discussing difference. And without difference, we have this kind of homogenized sameness, which, so basically I'm trying to say that we need, it doesn't have to be Jungian typology, but we need some kind of a way to distinguish between types, between cognitive styles, between functional preferences, between whether someone prefers to be active or passive, things like that. Even just that simple distinction, active-passive, extrovert-introvert, action-oriented, reflection-oriented, externally-oriented, internally-oriented, physically-oriented, mind-oriented, or psychically-oriented. These are the distinctions, and we need something like that minimum of distinction in order to affirm radical alterity, because if we don't have that, then it truly is normative. Then we truly are saying everyone's just the same, and that we all have basically the same. So, I guess my first point of discussion here is to talk about how typology has been rejected by the humanities departments. And I say that kind of as a catch-all umbrella term for so many different, literary criticism, critical theory, philosophy, psychology, psychoanalytic theory. A lot of it has rejected personality type because, again, it's kind of, we're so anti-normative now, and I'm anti-normative as well. The disagreement, the difference is that I say that we can use typology to critique normativity, whereas others would say typology itself is a form of normativity. I say that we can use typology as a way to combat labeling, which might be counterintuitive, because you would say, well, isn't typology just about labeling people? Isn't it just fitting people into boxes? But I would say we can use typology to show how certain people have been labeled and have been fit into boxes. For example, to show how people have been medicalized and labeled, as having mental illness simply because they're a certain type, which the other type demonizes. If society as a whole is run by extroverted thinking types, then introverted feeling types will be demonized. The same with intuitives get demonized oftentimes because sense types are very practical, pragmatic, and intuitives tend to be imaginary and artistic and creative and all these, not to say that sense types aren't, but basically we can use the language of typology to show how certain types throughout history have been marginalized, have been oppressed, their voices have been silenced. Even if we want to show, for instance, how women have been marginalized and oppressed through history, we could make the case that women predominantly are, for instance, feeling types rather than thinking. Now, this might seem to be horribly sexist, or, how can you say, isn't this just repeating the same sort of a sexist association that women aren't very smart or something like that? No, in fact, feeling types can be just as smart or smarter than thinking types. And the whole idea that feeling types aren't that smart is part of the oppressive idea that I'm criticizing. So it's very difficult, because I might say something like, well, feeling types have been oppressed throughout history, and women tend to be feeling types. Women have also been oppressed throughout history. If a man is a feeling type, he is derogated as feminine, and so on. But see, I might be critiqued by certain humanities type, certain like literary critics or post-colonial theorists or things like that. They might say, well, you're spreading the very oppression you claim to be critiquing through your normative understanding of women being affiliated with the feeling type, or something like that. Or similarly, if I say that women tend to be, this or that, if I try to find, but the fact of the matter is, if we look at the statistics, and I'm not such an empiricist, I don't care so much about statistics, but if we look at statistics, we do find that men are predominantly thinking types and women are predominantly feeling types. And so you get into questions like, why aren't there more women in the hard sciences like engineering and computer science and things like that? And mostly the debate goes, the reason women aren't in these fields is not because there's any difference between men and women, but because men and women are basically the same, except that in these fields there's so much entrenched sexism, and that there's so much that women aren't welcome in these fields. And that's probably true. There is a tremendous amount of entrenched sexism. But I would say that I do affirm radical difference. And by affirming radical difference, what I mean is that there is something like an ineluctable alterity between male and female. Even if a man becomes a woman or vice versa, or even if we add new categories, we still use male and female as the sort of asymptotes, or the, if you have a sine wave, there's the peak and the valley on either side of the sine wave. And so these kind of asymptotic points of reference, basically. So, even if none of us is purely active or purely passive, purely thinking or purely feeling, purely intuitive or sensing, purely male or female, each of us is an admixture of various humors, to put it in the classic way of explaining it. That still doesn't, and so the thing is, so basically the humanities department critique says, well, so you say that women are predominantly feeling types, and you say that feeling types have been derogated throughout history by culture. But which culture? It seems to me that you have this universal, ahistorical sort of a theory and so on, but I would say no, it is very much tied to history, and the fact of the matter is that throughout history, various cultures have developed, to be run by predominantly thinking types, and to be run predominantly by men. And I'm not saying that, as we and Eisler pointed out, that there may have been, I'm not saying that there weren't maternal organizations, but the problem is, this was pointed out by Levi Bryant, the great contemporary philosopher of object-oriented ontology. Levi Bryant pointed out that if somebody heralds Sarah Palin as a exemplary, as an example of a strong woman, an exemplary strong woman, what they fail to grasp is that Sarah Palin is an exemplary strong man, that she has merely imitated the masculine, sovereign sort of, it's almost, if a woman becomes strong, then she becomes like a man. And that is the difficult thing that we want to get around, because someone like Sarah Palin is not an example. She's not a shining, stellar example of femininity. She's a shining, stellar example of masculinity. And that's what's so hard to grasp, is that basically, again, Sarah Palin is like, she presents herself as a sovereign, autonomous, independent, strong-willed, and, all these things, these are typically masculine traits, the traits of sovereignty, of autonomy, of independence, and so on. So the problem is that if we critique typology as perpetuating sexism or perpetuating certain masculine privilege and so on, we lose a vocabulary with which we can actually use to make that same critique. So in a way, I think if we eschew typology, then we no longer have the right vocabulary to fully flesh out the critique that we claim typology. If we're critiquing oppression and marginalization, it's helpful to have typology theory because we can use type theory as a way to critique oppression and marginalization by showing how certain types have been marginalized and oppressed throughout history. So the critique that typology perpetuates marginalization and oppression fails to grasp that typology itself is, a way of talking about difference of distinctions between people, which itself can be used to make that same critique. So that's on the humanities department side. Now on the other side of it, we have the science departments and the kind of more, the hard sciences and so on, which demand falsifiability. They demand evidence. And, the critique would basically be, well, if you can't think of a falsifiable case, like anything you can think of is explained by this theory. So there's nothing which it's almost, typology is a theory of everything, because each and every person fits into one of the type categories. Nobody's outside of type. There's no human who ever lived or ever will live who doesn't fit into one of those categories. I'm not saying that people don't maybe have a blend of categories, but see, the category is already taken into account because a category already says this category is a blend of those two other categories and so on. For instance, someone told me, well, I used to be this type and then I became a different type. And I said, well, that's not possible, because if you're a type that changes, that's already a type. It's the changeable type. So if you think that you're one type and you change to another type, that just means that your theoretical understanding of type isn't good enough to account for those changes, because any good type theory will itself already take into account, this is the type that feels like they're a different type. This is a type that feels like they're a blend of multiple types. This is a type which changes between types. This is a type which remains one type, and so on. Any good type theory will be able to take into account the variability of types. So when someone tells me, when I was younger I was this type, and as I grew older I became that type. No, you didn't change type, because type already is something that when you're younger, you use these functions more. As Carl Jung put it, a thinking type develops feeling in later years. A sensing type develops intuiting in later years. So each type already takes into account the variability, the changeability of the type. So essentially the scientific, in the modern contemporary sense of science, critique of typology is that typology is completely unscientific. It's unfalsifiable. Anything that there's no way to prove or to demonstrate. It's basically it's very much the pseudo-scientific kind of mumbo jumbo, which and I understand that critique. I mean, part of that critique is because so many people think that they can self-identify their type by taking some quiz which relies on self-assessment, failing to grasp each of us has so many cognitive biases and so much narcissism and ego defenses, and we have such idealized fantasy supplements about who we are and so on. So I very much agree. In fact, I agree with both critiques. It's funny. It's, the humanities critique of typology is that it perpetuates normativity, and I would say, well, poorly understood typology does. Poorly understood typology can almost be close to eugenics or something. It can be saying, people from this culture are more sensing types and they're not as advanced as the intuiting types, or feeling types aren't as smart as thinking. People who, it's almost a little bit of a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. If you know a little bit of type theory, you can perpetuate so much normativity and so much demonization of the other and things like that. But again, I would say, even though I agree in sentiment with the humanities department critique of typology, I would actually say that you can use typology to make that same critique against other beliefs. Then on the scientific side, I also agree with the critique of typology being unfalsifiable, and I see where they're coming from, where the scientifically minded tend to reject anything that you can just take a simple test online and do this self-assessment and kind of say, I'm this type, well that explains away, it's a just so story or some easy explanation. So I really agree with both critiques, but I think both of them fail to grasp that typology, can be used to level those same critiques. I mean, basically the vocabulary of typology is very useful because we can use the vocabulary of typology to attack oppression and marginalization, or on the other hand, we can use the vocabulary of typology to explain why certain types rely on falsifiability and empirical evidence, that would be the sensing types among us, and why certain types are more theoretical, the intuiting types. Someone like Hegel, who, when confronted with empirical evidence which contradicts his theory, says, so much worse for the facts. That's Hegel's famous quip. So much worse for the facts, meaning my theory must be correct, so even when the empirical evidence contradicts it, too bad for the empirical evidence. I'm sticking to my theory, even in the face of irrefutable evidence. So basically, we can use type theory to make the same critique that the humanities departments make about, basically, we can use typology and still be a critical theorist, and we can use typology to explain sometimes why people might be more scientifically minded or more theoretically minded. And I do think that those are totally different, because as Deleuze puts it, science is concerned with formulas, philosophy is concerned with concepts, which again is why science doesn't think, because thinking is non-formulaic, thinking is conceptual. And so, a computer program can be very scientific. It can be a very accurate scientific instrument. For example, a Google search, I type in, a search term, and it gives me search results. And it relies on science to do that. It relies on the computer science, the science of how to accurately, it's amazing, really. It's mind-boggling how advanced something like Google search is. But can you imagine if the program were philosophical, if Google were philosophical, if Google had concepts and not formulas? I might search for something, and then Google would say to me, "Are you sure you want to do that? Why do you want to do that? Is that really the right question?" Because again, science tries to answer questions. Philosophy tries to ask questions. As Zizek puts it, the philosopher should never answer a question. The philosopher should question whether that's the valid question all along. Because there are not only false answers, there are also false questions, false problems. So a scientist will try to answer a question by developing some formula, for instance. But a philosopher conceptually may question the question itself. So again, I do think that there is a distinction, and I would say that this is accounted for in personality type theory, because there, in especially Jungian theory, there's a distinction between sensing and intuiting types, where sensing types are very empirical, pragmatic, practical. Intuiting types tend to be more theoretical and not as practical. And again, this doesn't mean that intuitives don't sense or that sensors don't intuit. Everyone uses every function, more or less. It simply means that each of us has certain preferred functions. And based on our preferred functions, we tend to demonize those who, prefer a different function. So, all right, so now that I've gotten out of the way the question of normativity and the question of falsifiability, and I hope I've done a decent enough job expressing why I think both of those critiques of typology are invalid, I'd like to talk about the distinctions of various types. So historically, there were distinctions based on humors, which again are the idea that certain people are dry types, certain are wet types, certain are hot, certain are cold, and so on. And so the names for these temperaments are choleric, melancholic, sanguine, and phlegmatic. And so I won't go into each of these types, but basically one of them can be thought of as a very active type who is constantly on the go, and the other could be a very passive type. Just for example, I don't remember which type is which here, but so a very active type person might tell the passive one, might give advice and say, "You're always waiting around. If you don't go out and do something, life will pass you by. You won't have any opportunities. You have to make your own opportunities. You're not busy enough. You're lazy. You're sitting around not doing anything. You should be more busy." But then the passive type might tell the active type, "Well, if you're so busy all the time, life passes you by. You miss out on opportunities. Because I've found in my personal experience that by waiting, opportunities arise on their own." So one type says, I have to create my own opportunities, create my own fortune. The other type says, if I'm too busy creating opportunities, I'll miss the opportunities that come to me naturally without me trying. It's the idea, some of us prefer action, others of us prefer waiting, introspection even, thinking. As Zizek put it, everyone says, we've talked enough, it's time for action. But what if it's the opposite? We've acted enough. It's time to think. It's time to stop constantly acting. And so that would put Zizek on the side of being more passive. But I don't mean to classify him as a passive person. I mean, certainly it's more complex than that. It's simply that each type gives advice based on its own preferred attitude. And the advice it gives is good advice for people that have the same attitude, but it's horrible advice for someone with the opposite attitude. It completely discredits and, it totally neglects the alterity. Someone who's really active and really busy would demonize someone who's not active and busy as being lazy. And someone who's not active and busy, someone who's more passive and not as busy, would demonize the person who's so busy. Oh, that person's such a busybody, they're missing life, they don't know how to appreciate the finer things, the little things. It's not the destination, it's the journey, and so on. So each type kind of tends to demonize the counter type. Each attitude rejects the counter attitude and minimizes it, and so on. So there's a great website, ptypes.com. And I don't know the author of the website, but I got a lot of information from there that I really liked. And it's about personality type theory as seen through the Stoic lens. So again, that's ptypes.com. And the author brings a lot of the Stoic ideas to personality types by explaining that each personality type has a different set of vices, using the Stoic definition of vice, viciousness, evil, if you will. The Stoic definition of vice is somebody who applies the test of good and bad to external things, whereas virtue is applying the test of good and bad to internal things. So without going into Stoicism too much, suffice it to say that different types have different things that they value, different external things that they value. And each type has its good qualities, its virtues, but also its vices. And its vices are those things that it values as good or bad externally. So just to give an example, let me think of a good one here. All right, say I'm the perfectionist type. The perfectionist type thinks mistakes are bad. But a Stoic would say mistakes are not good or bad. Mistakes are indifferent. We should be indifferent to mistakes. But if I say mistakes are bad, then I become vicious because my personality type, the perfectionist type, is one that sees somebody making a mistake and says that's bad. And I see myself making mistakes and say that's bad. I shouldn't make mistakes. Well, obviously I can agree in sentiment. I mean, we should do our best to not make mistakes. But mistakes are inevitable. Mistakes happen. And so when I value mistakes as bad, I apply that value, I judge them as bad. I say mistakes are bad. Then I perpetuate vice. And so the idea here is that each type, there's no type outside of type, but each type has its different sets of goods and bads. And they're actually somewhat antithetical to each other. For instance, if I'm a leisurely type, what's called the leisurely type, I will say mistakes are indifferent. I know that mistakes aren't bad. But then I'll value something else as good, like personal freedom or pleasure. I'll say pleasure is good, or happiness is good, or relaxation is good. So anything that I value as good is its own viciousness because it fails to grasp that the opposite can also be good. If I'm a leisurely type, then I don't want anybody to put demands on me. And I say it's good to not have demands placed on you. Whereas if I'm a more perfectionist or, what's a good word for it? If I'm a vigilant type, then I might say responsibility is good. So one type says responsibility is bad because you're limiting me, you're trapping me. The other says responsibility is good. If I don't have responsibility, then I'm shirking it, I'm lazy, and so on. But neither type is right. Each type has its own particular truth, but that truth is based on this vicious judgment of something else externally as good or bad. So, at its most basic, we can split types between two. We can distinguish between two types, active, passive, external, internal. Perhaps we can say extrovert, introvert. And so at its most basic, extroverts have their own set of vices, their own set of false judgments of external things as good and bad. And introverts have their set of false judgments of external things as good or bad. And each demonizes and envies the other. So this is the most basic distinction, the split between two. Yin and yang, whatever you want to call it, active, passive principles. And between introvert, extrovert, there's this, the extrovert has a whole set of false goods. For instance, it is good to be engaged in the world. It is good to go out and do things. The extrovert might give an introvert advice like, wow, you've been cooped up inside so much. You should get out there. Or you don't hang out with enough people. You should have more friends and so on. But the introvert might give the extrovert advice, you should read more books. They say introverts have tons of interests. Extroverts have a lot of activities. So each one demonizes the other. The extrovert says, wow, you should join a club. You should go to the gym more. You should do to the introvert. The extrovert will say, you should have more activities. But the introvert will say, I don't want activities. You should have more interests. And each kind of demonizes the other. The introvert feels so deep, and the introvert says, oh, those extroverts are so superficial. Those extroverts don't have any depth. There's nothing going on inside. But then the extrovert can demonize the introvert and say, wow, that introvert's so boring. They have nothing going on in their life. It's like their life is empty. Because the introvert has a very empty external life, and the extrovert has a very empty internal life. I mean, sorry to generalize here, but typically extroverts don't have as much going on inside, and introverts don't have as much going on outside. And each type demonizes the other. The difficulty here is that I'm an introvert, so I really can't give an unbiased account of introverts or extroverts, because again, if you ask an introvert to describe them, they will describe the types completely differently than how an extrovert will describe them. Because there's no neutral position outside of type with which we could speak the truth about the type. Each type is its own truth. We can't speak the truth about truth. There is no truth about truth. Because each type has its own truth, that's the closest we can get, is this sort of subjectively engaged position to get to truth. There is no objective, external, apolitical, neutral position outside of positionality with which we could honestly give a description of various types. So starting with the most basic distinction, we have introvert, extrovert. But we can then distinguish 4 types then. I mean, certainly there are odd numbers. Some people have made typology with 3 types or 5 types or 7 types or whatever. But typically we have these even-numbered symmetrical splits, where we have the first split between introvert and extrovert. Then the next split we get 4 types. That can lead back to the 4 humors, the 4 temperaments, the 4 elements, a fire type, a water type. This even gets back to Freud did a lot of work in totem and taboo on different types of people. Different tribes had different totems, and so they would say, oh, we're an elk type, or you're a bear type. We're the deer type, and so on. So basically, after we get the distinction between 2 types, we typically go to 4 types. It's, for some reason, these even symmetrical sort of splits have been favored instead of odd splits. So the even split to go to the 4 types then, in Jungian typology, we would call this sensing, intuiting, feeling, thinking. Someone who's intuiting dominant or sensing dominant. I'm intuitive dominant. I'm also a thinking type, but my dominant type is intuition, which means my inferior is sensing. You can imagine it kind of like a diamond with the dominant superior function on top, the secondary and tertiary functions on either side, the inferior function on the bottom. And right through the middle could be the split between conscious and unconscious, where the inferior function tends to be more unconscious, less differentiated from the unconscious. So, after we go past 2 types, we get into 4 types. Beyond introvert, extrovert, we have thinking, sensing, feeling. And then we go to, thinking, and intuiting. And then we go to 8 types, because we can actually pair these together and say, oh, well, I'm introverted intuitive compared to an extroverted intuitive. Introverted intuitives make typically good theorists or philosophers. Extroverted intuitives make great business people because they have such a grasp of the external reality. They can intuitively see patterns and trends. They know where things are going. They're good at predicting outcomes. I'm good at making connections and predicting things internally in my internal world. Extroverted intuitives are good at they're really good at playing the stock market. Extroverted intuitives can make these great intuitive leaps. They have great intuitive comprehension. They grasp trends, where things are going, what outcome something is likely to have. So so we start with an introvert, extrovert. That's 2 types. Then we can make the distinction of 4 types. And then if we combine our distinction of 4 types with our original 2, we have 8 types. Introverted intuitive, extroverted intuitive, introverted thinking, extroverted thinking, and so on. Finally, we can get to 16 types. So to get to 16 types, the reason we do this is because it actually affects the order, the functional order. For instance, if I'm intuitive dominant, I might be thinking secondary, or I might be feeling secondary. If I'm feeling dominant, I might be intuitive secondary, or I might be sensing secondary. So when we get to 16 types, that's pretty much the furthest that's useful to go. And even still, Carl Jung did not differentiate between 16 types. Jung only had 8 types. It's the Myers-Briggs terminology and the Myers-Briggs theory, as well as Kiersey, David Kiersey, that came up with his theory of temperament. And it's these later additions to Jungian type theory, or modifications, that allow for 16 types. Carl Jung only distinguished between thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting, and whether that person is predominantly introverted or extroverted. So for Carl Jung, there were only 8 types. If you're an introverted intuitive, it doesn't matter if you have thinking or feeling secondary, because either way, you're almost siblings. If you have feeling secondary and thinking tertiary, or thinking secondary and feeling tertiary, it doesn't really make much difference for Carl Jung. Now, according to Myers-Briggs, there is a difference, and I do tend to agree with Myers-Briggs that there actually is a distinction. So I prefer the 16 types. For some reason, Theodore Millon says there are only 15 types, unless I misunderstood his theory. Maybe I missed a type, or maybe he left one type to be the type that can explain the rest. I don't know, but it seems like he only had 15 types. The funny thing is, there's even, this is almost ironic, when I was reading ptypes.com about Stoicism, the whole thing was saying how each type values different false goods and false bads, and that being Stoic means withdrawing your external valuations of things as good or bad. So then I asked myself, well, if you're Stoic, doesn't that mean you're a type outside of type? But then I read a little further and I found that one of the types is actually the Stoic type. The Stoic type is the type that values not valuing external things as good or bad as good. So it's one of those funny things where even if you say, we should be Stoic, we shouldn't value external things as good or bad, you're still valuing something external as good or bad. You're valuing being Stoic as good and not being Stoic as bad. So it's almost impossible to endorse Stoicism, because Stoicism is that unendorsable. It's that thing which, as soon as you proselytize, as soon as you evangelize Stoicism, it's no longer Stoic. It's almost like we could liken Stoicism to silence, that thing that is broken the moment it is spoken. You can't talk about it without breaking it. And it's the same with Stoicism. You can't endorse Stoicism without giving up Stoicism in some ways and not being Stoic. So, all right, so about the different types, let me just give a quick kind of enumeration, I guess. So, of the 4 functions, each of us tends to prefer one over the other 3. And then we each of us also prefers an attitude over another attitude. So an introverted intuitive prefers introversion over extroversion. Then if we make the 16 distinctions, as opposed to 8, what we get is different secondary and tertiary functions. It's still the same inferior, but the difference is the secondary and tertiary. So that's where we get into what in Myers-Briggs terminology are called judging and perceiving types. And so if I'm an introverted, intuitive, thinking, judging, which is in fact what I am, this is called INTJ in Myers-Briggs. And what that means is that I'm introverted dominant, thinking secondary, feeling tertiary, sensing inferior. But if I'm an INTP, that means perceiving dominant, I'm still introverted, I'm still intuitive, I'm still thinking, but I'm perceiving instead. And so the interesting thing about that is that actually then I would have thinking would be my dominant suit. I wouldn't really be an introverted intuitive, I'd be an introverted thinker predominantly. Then intuition is secondary, sensing is tertiary, and feeling is my inferior function. So depending whether I'm a judging or perceiving type, I have a different superior and different inferior function. So I'll speak about personal experience. As an INTJ, my inferior function is sensing. Now, what Carl Jung said is that by the age of 30, if you've sufficiently individuated, your first three functions can be all pretty well differentiated, fairly well developed. You can even be indistinguishable. So my first three functions are intuition, thinking, feeling. So I'm almost 30. Theoretically, it might be difficult to tell whether I'm a thinking type or a feeling type. But the one function which never, ever matures or differentiates the same as the others is the inferior. The inferior is always inferior. It's the Achilles heel. So you can tell I'm an intuitive because no matter how much I grow up and mature, and again, I don't need to say this in a normative way, but no matter how much I individuate, I can never raise up my inferior function to consciousness. It will never be as fast. I'll always be slow. So because I have inferior sensing, that means I have very poor memory. But it's not memory of theoretical stuff. I have poor sense memory, poor experiential memory. I don't have a really well-developed palate for taste. I can be very clumsy, and nothing I do will ever make me not clumsy. Certainly I should work on my inferior function. In fact, Carl Jung says we get some of the most rewarding experiences of our lives in developing our inferior functions. But I should never expect to be as good at my inferior function as somebody else for whom that function is their superior function. So for instance, sense types tend to be very good at sports. I am not good at sports, but I am pretty good at theory. I'm very theoretical. And so because I'm an intuitive, I shouldn't beat myself up about not being good at sports. I should simply accept I will never be a Michael Jordan or, I will never, I love basketball. Probably I like it because it's something I'm not very good at, and I can get in touch. I feel so proud if I fix something around the house because I'm not a fix-it person at all. And I feel so proud because I'm using my inferior function, and, typically I usually break something, but I do like to use it. And so, and it's vice versa. A sensing type would feel so proud for coming up with a new theory, or a feeling type would feel great pride for coming up with some ideas, thinking. And so, vice versa. And so the thing is, we have to be very careful because, if you know a feeling type, and if they come to you with some thinking, and you're a thinking type, you might be able to immediately see all the flaws in their logic. But if you just say, oh, well, you're wrong because this and this and this, if you tear them apart and criticize them, they'll almost, it's so hard for them to even come out with their inferior function that then they'll just hide it, and then they'll learn to just not show people that side of them, and it remains stunted. It remains permanently immature. So the inferior function is always very childlike, naive, immature. Someone who has inferior feeling will have very naive, childlike feeling. Very pure feeling, but still very naive. Someone with naive thinking will be perhaps too trusting or not logical, not rational. Their feelings will get the best of them. So, all right, I'd like to talk a little bit about each of the four ego functions. Now, I've been using these terms throughout this talk. Sensing, thinking, feeling, intuiting. What do they mean? Well, first I like to begin with sensing and intuiting. And the reason I talk about those together is because intuiting is really a form of sensing. Intuiting is when you are able to not notice the details, but notice the overall pattern. If sensing is looking at the trees, intuiting is looking at the forest. So if you say someone can't see the forest for the trees, they're too caught up on details, that's typically sensing. Somebody who sees the forest but might miss some details, that's intuiting. So really they're both the same, it's just that the intuitive person gets so many sense impressions, so overwhelmed by them, that the intuitive person can almost see the overall pattern in the impressions at the expense of detail, precision. The intuitive is very general and lacks a lot of the precision of a sense type. Intuitives don't notice details. For instance, I do not notice if somebody gets a haircut. I don't tend to notice if a new store opens up in my neighborhood. I don't notice if something changes. I tend to be so in my head that I don't notice typical physical sense world changes. A sense type is very present, very good with these things. But a sense type may not have the best intuition. A sense type might be very paranoid, for instance, because a sense type cannot trust his or her ability to accurately predict outcomes. Intuition is predicting the overall pattern, predicting outcomes, predicting trends, how something is likely to end up, what's likely to happen. And because a sense type has inferior intuition, a sense type may be very paranoid because they cannot rely on their own ability to successfully predict outcomes. So they may be very cautious, very worried about outcomes, anxious, and so on. So sensing and intuiting are both kind of on a spectrum, where on the one end of the spectrum is those who are extremely detail-oriented, and on the other end is those who are extremely general and non-detail-oriented. And so a sensing type, a pure sensing type, as far as we can, everyone's a mix of the types, of course, to some degree. But when we say a sensing type, we mean somebody who, has intuition, but doesn't prefer to use it. The sensing type is the person who prefers sensation. So the sensing type will be somebody who, really notices details. Sensing type writers tend to be very good with the actual choice of words and how the words feel. I was talking to a sense type friend, and I mentioned the word fictum. And fictum is a word from boundary logic, which is a fictionalized victim, a fictional victim. Like when you scapegoat somebody and say that that person's scapegoating you victimize yourself. That's kind of, beside the point. But my friend, who's a sensing type, introverted, sensing, thinking, judging, she said, wow, victim is such a horrible word. It just feels horrible. It just feels bad. It has a bad mouthfeel. Now, I never think about how a word feels to say it. To me, the word victim is totally suitable because, well, hey, it's a fictional victim. It makes sense, victim. But to her, she's very eloquent, very good writer. I can write, but I don't have the feeling, I don't have that same appreciation of how a word feels. The same with food. I like good food, but I don't have that palate, that appreciation. I typically don't have my sensation is not cultivated. You can think of the inferior function as somewhat uncultivated, unsophisticated. And so my sensing is not very sophisticated. I don't have a very sophisticated palate. So sensing and intuiting are on the same spectrum, but on the one end, the one extreme is people who almost are overwhelmed by sense. And so somebody who's a sensing type, especially introverted sensing types, can be totally overwhelmed by loud music, overwhelmed by strong smells. I'm the opposite. I don't even notice loud music. I can sleep with a party going on next door. I don't notice smells. I'm an intuitive, so I don't notice sense reality very much. I live mostly in my head. The other thing is that extroverted sense types are very much in the present. Introverted sense types live very much in the past and have excellent memory. My introverted sense type friend can remember what I was wearing when I met her 15 years ago. She can remember the label on the bottle of water that I was drinking. She remembers everything she had for breakfast for the last 6 months, and she remembers some of the most amazing meals she's had throughout her life. I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. I have the hardest time remembering very simple sense-oriented things. So again, the sense type is very much detail-oriented. Extroverted sense types tend to be present-oriented, very much in the moment. They notice things. Going for a long walk and looking at, the thing is, I really love long walks. I love sunsets. I love nature because it's so special and different for me. I don't do it very often. It's actually funny. I went out to nature with one of my sense type friends, and I was having a very spiritual experience. It's like spiritual for me to go out to nature because I'm an intuitive. So I don't really have much access to sense experience. And what Carl Jung said is that each of our inferior functions is always our access to the numinous, the way we access spirituality. So for me, I access spirituality through my sense type, my sense function, But I went with my sensing friend, and he's just like, no big deal. In fact, we went to Montgomery National Forest, and one of the biggest trees in the entire world. It's like 2,000 years old. There's a grove of these beautiful old-growth redwoods. And I felt like the trees had spirits, the trees had personalities. I felt like the trees were alive and thinking and feeling, and I could connect with them and commune with them in a spiritual way. And my sense-type friend was just like, whatever, I've seen trees. Seen one, I've seen them all. Well, he's not into frivolous. He's very practical, pragmatic. This same friend doesn't believe in any psychology except cognitive psychology. He doesn't believe in astrology or synchronicity. He doesn't believe in anything foo-foo, esoteric, new age, occult, any of that stuff, mystical. He's very nuts and bolts, practical. His dad's an auto mechanic, also a sense type, who's very much about fixing things, very pragmatic and practical. So, it's really interesting. It's basically, because I'm an intuitive, when I do use sensing, it is very special for me, and I react differently. Whereas a sensing type, it's kind of old hat to them. They're sensing all the time, so it's no big deal to have some sort of, if I dance is very ecstatic for me. Dance is very much, sacred and spiritual. But then a sense type, just, for them, it's exercise. I might even say sexuality. For an intuitive, sexuality tends to be very spiritual and sacred because, again, it's a sense-oriented thing, very sensual. But for a sense type, sexuality can be nothing more than exercise or sport. To me, the idea of sexuality as sport is laughable. I couldn't imagine such a thing. It's so far away from my attitude towards things. So sensing and intuiting are on this spectrum where some people are closer to the middle, but typically people land on one side or the other, and it's noticeable. And I would also say that intuition, so sensing can be either past or present oriented, but intuition is always future oriented. Intuition is very future oriented. Now, I'm wondering if there's any correlation between living close to the equator and how sense oriented you are. Because I read a study that found the further from the equator you live geographically, the more likely you are to be future-oriented, to plan for the future. And there may actually be evolutionary reasons for this, because if you live in a really snowy place, you have to ration your food, you have to plan more. If you live where it's sunny and full of abundance all the time, and the seasons aren't that extreme and stuff, then you maybe don't have to plan as much. You can kind of enjoy the moment. And again, we get the split between the attitudes, where the one type demonizes the other, you don't plan enough. The other type says, well, you're so busy planning, you don't enjoy life. So, I would say that I wonder that there might be a correlation, because intuitives tend to be much better at planning and predicting outcomes, very future-oriented, thinking about the future. But it's very hard for intuitives to be present. Intuitives oftentimes have their mind wander, and they have a difficult time, for instance, having the hardest thing is intuitives can be very frustrating because we interrupt people a lot, and we kind of, the classic intuitive thing is wrap it up. Like if I'm in a meeting, literally all I want to do every time someone starts talking is this, because I already know their point. They could be like 4 words into the sentence. I know this is extremely arrogant, narcissistic of me, but someone could be 4 words into a sentence, and I know what they mean. And that person might then take 10 sentences to really get their point across. The thing is, even myself, I annoy the hell out of other intuitives, because like this talk, for instance, I'm kind of repeating myself and I'm going over things again and again. An intuitive will pick up exactly what I mean immediately, and they'll be like, come on, Jonah, why are you saying this 5 different ways? I only need one example. I can grasp it immediately. I already comprehend based on this one example. The philosopher Louis Althusser, I don't really know how to say his name, Althusser. He was a French philosopher who claimed to have never read any philosophy books in his life. Well, more precisely, he would flip through a few pages and he would get the gist of it. He'd read the beginning, he'd read the end. He would basically, he read 5 pages of Plato and he knew what it was all about. Basically, he claims that on the one hand, he felt like he was a fake, a poser, that his whole life he wasn't authentic, he was just pretending or faking it. But on the other hand, he shouldn't feel guilty for that, because that's his gift. It's a blessing and a curse. Intuitives often feel like they're faking it because they don't put in the time, they don't have the due diligence to really read through something all the way, and they can miss things. Intuitives oftentimes miss details. But it's also a blessing because intuitives have lightning fast comprehension. Intuitives, I used to never study, for my PSAT or SAT or whatever. I wouldn't study at all. I would just go in and ace the test, because I could, especially if it's multiple choice. But even if it's not multiple choice, if it's something like reading comprehension or writing an essay about something, I can totally ace those tests because I can intuitively grasp what the right answer is or whatever, as opposed to a sense type who would spend a lot of time studying and learning by rote and memorizing. I have horrible memory, but great improvisational skills. I can procrastinate endlessly, but when it comes time to do something, it turns out I didn't really need to prepare after all, because no matter how unprepared I am, I can come up with something intuitively in the spur of the moment. And of course I feel horribly guilty about this, I feel like, wow, I'm just faking it, like Althusser, like he felt like a fake because he never read any philosophy books. He would just flip through them and get the gist of it and then move on. But you know what? There's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for the ability of the intuitive to comprehend something intuitively. Which is not to say that we don't need to develop our inferior functions as well. We certainly do. So sensing and intuition, they're kind of a spectrum, and according to Carl Jung, they always come first. Thinking and feeling come after, meaning that even if you're thinking dominant, you still intuit or sense something first, and then the thinking or the feeling is a way of analyzing it. So thinking and feeling are analytical. They're judging functions. Both thinking and feeling are judging, whereas sensing and intuiting are non-judgmental. So what's interesting here, according to Carl Jung, sensing and intuiting are both irrational, whereas thinking and feeling are both rational. Now what's interesting about this is many people feel or think that feelings are not rational. How often have you heard, oh, you're just being swayed by feelings, you're not being rational? But according to Carl Jung, feelings are rational. Both thinking and feeling are rational analyses of sensing or intuiting. So just like sensing and intuiting are on a spectrum, thinking and feeling are also on a spectrum. And they always come after. Thinking and feeling are always second to sensing and intuiting. So if I'm a thinking dominant person, it means that I'm very good at analyzing, at thinking, but I may not be, I may value thinking more than intuiting or sensing. Because I'm intuitive dominant, I value intuition first and foremost. So I value sort of intuitive leaps of faith even more than I value logic. Something can be irrational, but I still appreciate it because I have an irrational function as my dominant function. If I were a feeling or thinking type, I would actually have a rational. I would be rational then, more rational. So it's interesting because people kind of tend to demonize feeling types as being irrational, but according to Jung, no, the feeling type is not irrational. The feeling type is just as rational as the thinking type. Indeed, feeling types judge. So what's interesting is you might kind of equate feeling and emotion. And it is true that we feel emotions. But according to Jung, feeling is actually responsible for all of our axiological value judgments. Axiology is the study of ethics on the one hand and aesthetics on the other, which are the two things we can say are good and bad. Aesthetics, good art, bad art. Ethics, good actions, evil actions. So with the opposition good, bad, and the opposition good, evil, that makes axiology as a whole. And the feeling function is concerned with axiology, in that the feeling function applies good and bad to things, like quality, good and bad quality. This is well made, this is poorly made. This is good art, this is bad art. And good and evil is applied to ethical actions. So feeling is actually concerned not only with style and manner and aesthetic concerns, but feeling is also concerned with ethics, with the ethical actions, like what is good and what is evil. And the interesting point here is that you might think that a judge in a court of law is using thinking to rationally think of what is a good judgment. But according to Jung, or maybe this is actually James Hillman in his essay, The Feeling Function, following Jung, the judge actually employs, regardless of this judge's type, the judge employs feeling in making a judgment. Because one judgment feels too light for the crime committed, the other judgment feels too heavy for the crime committed. And it's only when a judgment feels appropriate for the crime that the judgment is passed. Indeed, the feeling function is what determines the weight of the judgment. It's ultimately because feeling is judging. So the thing is, feeling is what judges, this is good, this is bad. And the problem, the problem feeling types often have is that they don't question their judgments. Not to say that thinking doesn't judge as well, but for instance, a feeling type may know what she or he likes and doesn't like, whereas a thinking type may be out of touch with what she or he likes and doesn't like. The feeling type may know this, especially an introverted feeler, or someone who has introverted feeling. Extroverted feelings function knows what other people like and dislike. So, an introverted feeler may know what she or he likes and dislikes, but may not know why she or he likes or dislikes. And what Carl Jung said is that there's a momentous occasion in the individuation process, which is when we stop asking what we like and dislike, and when we start asking why we like and dislike the things we do and don't like. So basically, each type has its pitfalls. The feeling type pitfall tends to be that they'll be in touch with what they like and dislike. They'll be in touch with their feelings, but not have the conceptual underpinning. The thinking type may be very conceptual, but not in touch with feelings. A thinking type may not realize he's in love. For instance, Slavoj Žižek told a story of two of his friends. One of his friends had begun recently dating, and one of the other friends said to his first friend, "You are in love, you just don't know it yet." And what this gets at is the fact that each of the functions is a part of, it's a way of accessing the unconscious, and the unconscious is somewhat autonomous. It has its own will. And so if we fall in love, for instance, we might not know it. If we're not a feeling type, we might be out of touch with our feelings. We may be out of touch with whether or not we're in love. Conversely, we may fall out of love and we might not realize it. And it's the same thing with, the speed with which somebody can utilize that function. So a thinking type is very quick with thinking, very quick at conceptually grasping things. Kind of like the intuitive. The intuitive grasps patterns. The thinking type is very logical and can remain very objective and so on, insofar as objectivity is possible, which of course, we're all biased in some way. But the thinking type has very slow feeling, which means that a thinking type may have a very stressful day at work and then come home from work and have the hardest time shaking it. What Marie-Louise von Franz said is that someone who has inferior feeling, like a thinking type will have inferior feeling, their feeling is slow, like molten lava. It moves like magma. It's slow, hot, wet, clingy. She even said that someone with inferior feeling has the most pure feeling, very pure, dog-like affection, childlike affection even. So it's not that thinking types don't have feelings. In fact, their feelings can be some of the most sincere feelings you've found. I mean, that's what's interesting, is that there's a lot of misunderstandings and myths, misconceptions about feeling types. For instance, one example Marie-Louise von Franz gave is that as a nation, Germany tends to be more thinking-oriented. They're great engineers, very scientific, very objective. And then France, particularly Paris, tends to be more feeling, very refined feeling. Their manners, their style, very cultural, art, creativity, these all have to do with feeling. As Deleuze put it, art is concerned with affects and persons. And insofar as feeling has to do with affect, feeling is very much related to art. Art can give you a certain feeling and so on. So basically, and I'm not saying that Germans are not artistic. I'm not saying that France doesn't have its share of engineers. I'm simply saying overall, the nation of Germany tends to be better at engineering, that famous German engineering. And this is pointed out by von Franz. Paris in particular is known as a bastion of culture, a feeling center of the world even. But does this mean people are really emotional in France? No. And this is the misconception. People think, oh, you're a feeling type, you must be so emotional. But what is it to be emotional? To be emotional means your emotions are getting the best of you. You're almost being possessed by your emotions. If you're emotional, you're being overwhelmed by emotion. In fact, being emotional is the opposite of having a strong emotional resolve. So what von Franz says in her book, Typology, is that yes, it's true, the German people tend to not be emotional in some cases, but all you need to do is catch them when they're exercising their inferior function, and you find the most infantile, undifferentiated feeling. Because they're thinking types with inferior feeling, you'll find so much sentimentality, extreme emotion. They'll be crying and full of emotion in such things as overly sentimental, patriotic songs about the motherland or something like that. All you have to do is go to a bar and hear the German the beer drinking songs to find how, because when people drink, their inferior function tends to come out. And all you have to do is, see the Germans singing their sentimental drinking songs. And those are all songs that, a cultured Parisian would roll her eyes at. The cultured Parisian would scoff and say, that's so sentimental, that's so unevolved, unsophisticated. Because again, sophistication is not, the domain of only one function. Each function can be sophisticated or unsophisticated. So because Germans have such highly sophisticated thinking, they tend to be very unsophisticated in feeling. And again, this is a generalization. I don't mean to say everybody from Germany, but historically, there is such a thing as national identity and national shadow and so on. And the nation of Germany tends to have, very sophisticated thinking, very good at science and engineering, and very unsophisticated feeling, which comes out in things like sentimental, drinking songs and whatnot. Now compare that to Paris. Paris is very sophisticated feeling, perhaps some of the most sophisticated feeling in the world, and relatively unsophisticated thinking. So what you find with Parisians is that it's not that they're emotional. In fact, they have a strong emotional resolve. Just imagine the archetypal or stereotypical Parisian, dressed in black, smoking an expensive cigarette, rolling, jaded, cynical, rolling his or her eyes, scoffing, kind of, maybe even unemotional. Because the thing is, someone with a very well-developed feeling function has the capacity to feel, but is not overwhelmed by feeling. Someone with well-developed feeling has appropriate feelings for the time. Their timing is on. With underdeveloped feeling, the timing is off. For instance, someone who is feeling inferior heard that his best friend had lost, I think it was his wife. And this thinking inferior man was unable to offer any solace, and he came across completely cold and unfeeling. He simply could not feel sad. He couldn't feel empathy for his friend's loss. And so his friend ended up feeling very frustrated. It ended up feeling like, what is this? My best friend isn't even sad for me when I lost someone I'm so close to. But then the very next day, this feeling inferior man was overcome by the most severe sadness, melancholy and so on, and grief even. And so at that point, he was overcome, and he cried and felt so horrible for his friend's loss. But then, the next time he saw his friend, maybe even the next day, again, he was unable to be empathic. He didn't show any empathy. It's almost the inferior feeling comes and goes as it pleases. It's not quick. It's very slow, and it takes things a while, and maybe something happened a couple days ago, and then a few days later the person gets in a really bad mood and can't explain why, and it's because they were hurt from a few days ago. And then there's all these, someone with a well-developed superior feeling or mature feeling they'll understand how to be serious when the time is serious, but how to be humorous and whimsical when the time is very humorous and whimsical. So someone like that could go to a funeral or a wedding, perhaps, and be very serious and very seriously honor the ritual as it's occurring. But then afterwards might be able to be whimsical and to be very light and not to remain serious. Whereas someone with inferior feeling will be whimsical when they should be serious and serious when they should be whimsical. It's kind of almost a timing issue. And there's certainly something to do with slowness. Someone with very slow feeling, it's like their feeling takes a while. They take a while to know how they feel about something. If you ask what they feel like doing, they might be indecisive, or they may simply, here's the downside of having an inferior function is that we're constantly tempted to make up for it with our superior function. But that's not good. It's better to give the inferior function time to then give us the true answer of what it really wants. Because see, if I'm feeling inferior, then my thinking is so quick that if you ask me what I feel like doing, I'll answer what I think I feel like doing. And then what I think I feel like doing might not be what I really feel like doing. It's just what I think would be enjoyable for some reason. That's my thought, I might not feel like going out to a party, but I might think I should go out to a party or something, and so I'll say, yes, sure, I'll go. It sounds like fun, because logically it's something that people do, and so on. So getting in touch with feelings is a very slow process for someone who's feeling inferior. And vice versa. Someone who's thinking inferior will have a very difficult time comprehending things. That person may have to read the same page over and over to grasp the meaning behind it, to comprehend it, to understand what is signified by a certain set of signifiers. And then we can say the same about sensing versus intuition. I'm very quick to intuit, but I'm very slow in the sense world, I didn't learn to drive until I was in my 20s. Some people learn to drive when they're 14. It just wasn't very important to me. But, this not important to me is because it's almost the arrogance or the elitism of each type, I tend to demonize sense types and tend to have this sort of arrogant, intuitive sort of, oh yeah, we're intuitives. But see, sense types do the same thing. So, in fact, there was a hilarious article I read. It's called The Default Personality Type. And it's talking about the dominant personality types, which for men, most men are extroverted, sensing, thinking, judging. Most women are extroverted, sensing, feeling, judging. And this article that I read, which was obviously not written by a sensing type, was very critical. I mean, it was kind of, it was calling them conformists and so on. But there's some truth to it. But it also showed the elitism of each type, and it showed the biases, the difficulty each type has in describing the other. Because I don't know what the author of this article, I don't know what type this author was. But the author basically said, the default personality type, you know them because it's most of the people out there. They're the conformists. They're the ones who hate anyone who's different, and they root anyone who's different out of the social network and ostracize them. They belong to hundreds of clubs. They're members of so many organizations of people just like them. They want to belong. More than anything, they feel good about belonging and following the rules. They're the Dwight Schrutes from The Office. The people who, they understand the rules literally. They don't think about the rules, they just follow the rules. So, obviously, there's some truth to it, but that depiction is very negative. I mean, it's kind of demonizing most people. It's kind of saying most people are just sheep, and they're just conformists, and they're just slaves, or whatever, all like Nietzsche saying, most people have slave morality because they're so weak, and blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of elitism. But it almost makes sense because if you look at, for example, my personality type is strongly associated with narcissism. It's very much an elitist personality type. And if you look at the statistics, only about 1% of men and about 0.5% of women are my personality type. So there's so few of us. And we've been so alienated and so ostracized, it's almost, narcissism as the myth of being special and unique and different and all this. Well, it's hard to not be narcissistic if you really are 1 in 100 people, But at the same time, I do think that, it's never good to be elitist because each type has its shadow functions. Each type, we always demonize, but we're also kind of envious of the opposite type. I'm the same type as Christopher Hitchens. Not that I agree with him, because the other funny thing is some types are very agreeable with each other, and some types are very disagreeable. And my type, intuitive, introverted, thinking, judging, I don't get along with other intuitive, introverted, thinking, judging types at all because we're so opinionated, we're so judgmental, we each have our firmly held beliefs and so on. But other types, tend to get along great with each other because they're so similar. I mean, I'm similar to people that are the same type as me, but we would hate to even think we're similar. We would say, oh, we're not similar at all. We would reject this. We're the type that wants to feel so unique and special and so on. So there's pitfalls for every type. There's the elitism of being 1 in 100, but then there's also the populist sort of elitism. It's populism, I guess. So there's elitism on both sides, because populism itself is a sort of elitism. It's almost like the paradox of pride. There's pride in having pride for things, but there's also pride in humility. There's pride in not having pride in things. So you almost can't escape pride. And similarly, you can't escape a certain kind of elitism, which is, again, the cognitive bias that each of us has, which favors our own personality type. So there's almost this inescapable privilege of the INTJ type, in my case, where I tend to have this kind of fantasy of, self-aggrandizement and so on. And even explaining that I have that is even more of a way of showing my mastery. Like, I'm such a master, I even know my own flaws. More of that narcissistic, junk. But each type has that. Each type has its own pride. And this even gets back to the Stoic idea of vice, because in a way, vice is pride. The idea here is related to the work of Reinhold Niebuhr, or Niebuhr, I think it's Niebuhr, who had this idea, well, and also Karen Horney, it's the idea of the quest for glory, or, pride as the source of vice. And it's this desire to make your parents proud, or to be proud, to make your nation proud. I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have pride, because, again, to attempt to not have any pride is to be proud of not having pride. It's more just that each type has its own pride, its own things it prides itself on, which is the things it's really good at, its own superiority. And then each type kind of hides its own inferiority while also envying others who are really good at the thing that type is not good at, and also demonizing them. So it's this weird thing where I will simultaneously demonize sense types, but I also kind of envy them. And so, I lost my point about Christopher Hitchens. So Christopher Hitchens is the same type as me. And I was kind of saying, I don't really like him that much because, as types we don't really tend to get along. INTJs don't get along that well with each other. But my one point was there's a great article online called Christopher Hitchens, INTJ, and Inferior Sensing. And it was showing how Christopher Hitchens has this kind of bizarro sensing, which is very common to INTJs, to introverted intuitives. Because we're so bad at sensing, we demonize sensing, but we are also envious of it. And see, sensing types can be very cool. They can be very, my personality type is not very cool. So I can be really envious of them, but I can also demonize them. And so what this article was saying is that for someone like Christopher Hitchens, he redefines cool to be someone who's really well-read and someone who knows a lot of theory. It's kind of like this bizarro version of cool, where it's cool to not be cool in the typical way people think of as cool. It's cool to be nerdy and geeky. It's kind of this way of demonizing all the cool kids by saying, oh yeah, well you think you're so cool, but really, it's cool to not be cool, or something like that. And so it's a really, I'm not doing the best job explaining it, but this article I read on Christopher Hitchens, it's on celebritytypes.com. If you Google celebrity types, Christopher Hitchens, INTJ, you'll find it. And it's an article that really points out how, introverted intuitives tend to envy and demonize extroverted sense types. Because, extroverted sense types can be very, very good. They exude a sort of a sexual charisma. They can be very good at seducing people, very seductive, very charismatic. They can be very good at making people feel like they're being paid attention to, whereas as an intuitive, I give people the impression I'm never listening to them. I'm just always in my own head, waiting for my turn to speak, stuff like that. People get really annoyed by that. But, the sense type is very good at being present and listening and letting the other person speak, making the other person feel like they're the only person that matters. Because the sense type, again, can be so present, can give the person all of their attention. I have a very hard time focusing my attention on what somebody else is saying. As soon as they start speaking, as an intuitive, I immediately have 10 new ideas, and I have to filter through these ideas, and I have to, So, as an intuitive, I kind of envy that, but I also demonize it. And what this article about Christopher Hitchens was saying is that you can find time and time again in his writings where he sort of idolizes or glamorizes this bizarro extroverted sensing where it's like, it's cool to be uncool. It's cool to be a nerd. And he also has a weird way of kind of, he almost uses sexual innuendos, kind of like Slavoj Žižek, because sex is such a sensual thing, intuitives are so bad at it that they almost demonize it, but they also try to incorporate it somehow in a very strange way, like using sexual metaphors and sexual jokes, sexual innuendos, a lot of obscenity. If you listen to Slavoj Žižek, even his newest book, Less Than Nothing, I just got the new Slavoj Žižek book, and it's split into 3 parts. The drink before, the thing itself, and the cigarette after. And of course he's talking about his book is split into a couple hundred pages of flirtation and building up to the thing itself, that's all of the seduction, all of, and then the thing itself is like the main part of the book, that's like the sex, I guess, and then the cigarette after, the sort of, aperitif. And so people like Slavoj Žižek, who himself is an intuitive dominant with inferior sensing, he kind of, on the one level, he demonizes sex. Like, he was asked about sex, and he said something like, if you mean, animal copulation, I try to never have it. So he kind of demonizes, the actual act of copulation and so on. But on the other hand, almost everything he writes has this sort of sexual underpinning, but it comes out in kind of a obscene, perverted, unsophisticated way, kind of, he makes a lot of dirty jokes, and he has a lot of kind of really immature, so really it's funny that each type kind of incorporates, and also sense types do the same thing, but with their intuition. A good story from von Franz was this sense type that she knew, sense dominant, who was one of the most rational, objective, just the facts people you can imagine. But sometimes at night, sitting around the campfire, this sense type would reveal, when she opened up, that she had the most fantastic, outrageous, belief in ghosts, belief in the supernatural, things that intuitives would roll their eyes at, because intuitives have much more sophisticated understandings of these things. But a sense type almost has this very immature, infantile, afraid of ghosts and stuff like that. And so this sense type, if you got a few drinks into her, or if you talked to her around a campfire, she really opened up and let her inferior function show, would reveal that she believes the most superstitious things. But then the next morning, she would write it off and say, I don't believe any of that, that's just junk, that's garbage, and so on. So it's really funny how each type kind of has the disavowed, disowned opposite, the counter type, latently in potentia from the unconscious, and every now and then we let that out. I have this latent sense type inside of me because I'm an intuitive, and every now and then I let out that inferiority through something like an obscene joke, like how Zizek would. And then sense types let out their inferior intuition through, things like paranoia, or things like belief in superstitions, and things that an intuitive would kind of laugh at and roll their eyes at. So each type kind of rolls its eyes at, because it's so sophisticated in one function, people who are unsophisticated with that function, who have that function as their inferior, get kind of scoffed at. The superior feeling type, like the Frenchman, will kind of scoff at the inferior feeling of the German drinking songs and all of that sentimentality. Feeling types are very unsentimental. And the thinking type will kind of scoff at the flaws in logic and the faulty logic, the fact that somebody can be so subjective and so on. So really it's this strange combination of demonizing and envying the opposite type, or the opposite attitude. Introverts kind of demonize and envy extroverts, and vice versa. So finally, I'd like to say that I think typology is an affirmation of alterity, and I think we need an affirmation of alterity more than ever. So I kind of touched on this earlier when I was saying that you can use typology as a way to affirm radical difference, as opposed to sort of saying everyone's the same, we're all homogenous. But I think it bears repeating that typology affirms that what is true for one might not be true for another. What is a medicine for one may be poison for the other. That if you're asked what to do in a given situation, the only accurate answer is always, it depends. I heard a quote somewhere, I forget where, that, people who claim to be experts typically have some one-size-fits-all answer, but those are not true experts. The true expert, it's almost like Socrates, the true wise man is the one who knows that he doesn't know anything. Well, the true expert is the one who, anytime you ask a yes or no question, answers, it depends. And I think that typology as a radical affirmation of alterity tells us that it always depends. It always depends what type. A thinking type will give thinking type advice to everyone, regardless of what type that person is. So the thinking type will be telling a feeling type all this advice, which is really suitable for a thinking type, but not suitable at all for a feeling type. And a feeling type will give really good advice, and so on. Each type kind of gives advice which is true for that type only, but is actually the worst possible advice for the counter type. So, it's even like what Zizek said about philosophers, how we should question the questions, we philosophers. And it's, his idea, he said that more and more in colleges, they're being told to come up with experts and expert opinions who can answer the questions, the problems of today. But what this fails to grasp is that the domain of philosophy is always about questioning the questions. So the great example from Zizek was that during the 1968 French student protests, all of the questions coming from the theorists were always, what are the appropriate questions to ask now? They were asking all these new questions and questioning questions. But then if you look at the, I don't know if it was 2006 French riots, something else happened entirely. Instead of the psychoanalytic theorists, the psychologists, the philosophers asking the questions, they were asked the questions by government officials who said things like, to the psychologists, how can we best handle unruly crowds? How can we keep people docile? How can we keep people, happy, and so on? And to the philosophers even, don't ask the questions of us, we will ask the questions of you. So each type is almost struggling. Well, as I think it was Judith Butler put it, there's tremendous power in asking the question. And so I guess what I mean here about typology is that each type has its own questions, which it thinks is the most important question. And it values these questions as the most important questions, the question. But there's tremendous power in being able to ask the questions. So, if a thinking type says the important question, the thing that's really important is X, whatever, being objective. Well, that's what's really important to a thinking type, but that's failing to grasp that a feeling type holds something else to be very important, and so would a sensing or intuiting. And so, typology can affirm alterity, which means that it can affirm the fact that different types have different important questions to ask, and that there's tremendous power in being able to ask the question, that we shouldn't merely answer the question. That's what Zizek calls fighting on the enemy's terrain. Now, on the one hand, we should never hesitate to speak in our opponent's terminology. As Karl Popper put it, we should always be willing to use the vocabulary of our enemies. But I think we should only use their vocabulary insofar as we can use it to question their own questions themselves, to question whether those questions are the true questions. We should never accept yes or no questions as the question. In fact, a philosopher should never even be asked a yes or no question, because the answer to any yes or no question will always be, it depends. Even if you ask, is this ethical? Is that unethical? It depends. It always depends. And so as much as I love someone like Socrates, I think Socrates even has this problem of asking too precise questions. And when you ask questions that are so precise, it fails to grasp that by doing so is a way of maintaining control and saying these are the important questions. But that all good philosophers should refuse to answer yes or no questions and should instead ask whether the question itself is valid or not. And so basically in closing, I just like to say that the reason I value typology theory of the various kinds is because I think typology affirms alterity. I think typology affirms that we're not all the same. We're not homogeneous. We're heterogeneous. We are different. People are different. And as such, different types have different things that are valuable to them. And it's the most arrogant, it's the definition of hubris to think that you know the right question, that's the correct question to ask, and then to insist on yes or no answers to that question. That is the definition of hubris. To ask someone a yes or no question and to not be satisfied with the answer, it depends. Because anytime I'm asked a yes or no question, I always answer, it depends. That's the only accurate question, the only accurate answer I can give. Because ultimately, I question the questions. And this is because I do believe in something like radical alterity, which is the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all, homogeneous, bite-sized answer. I agree with Gerald Graff. We should be reductive. We shouldn't be afraid of simplifying things. We shouldn't be afraid of bite-sized answers. But at the same time, we shouldn't kowtow or give in to being forced into answering a yes or no question. Because to do so is to assume that we're all the same and that the same questions are relevant to everybody. And that is where typology, the greatest benefit of typology to me is giving a vocabulary which explains the differences in people. So to me, typology is a vocabulary for talking about difference. Typology says people are not all the same. And the fact that people are different means that we do not value the same things. Each type has its own value systems and so on. And so to really let the marginalized speak we have to first accept that some people are marginalized. And when we look at why they're marginalized, it's typically because they have a type which is undervalued by society as a whole, perhaps even because there's less of them. Like there's only 1 in 5 introverts, so introverts tend to be marginalized. We're the minority. Minorities tend to be marginalized. So to really be able to, affirm alterity and to let the subaltern speak, to give a voice to those who have been silenced, we need something like a vocabulary of typology, because such a vocabulary gives a nice account, a very accurate account of alterity, of difference. So I think it's important, and I'm not saying that we can't do typology wrong, too. I mean, a lot of people get typology totally wrong, and they use typology as a way to reject alterity. But I'm saying that properly understood, typology is actually the affirmation of alterity. Thanks for listening. Take care.